The relationship between art and artist is an oft ambiguous one. Is the artist directly implicated in his or her art? Or can the art be appraised on its own, irrespective of the biographical details of the artist? William Burroughs seems to me an exemplary case of the former, and in Barry Miles's book Call Me Burroughs, A Life, he examines in great detail the biography of William Burroughs the man. And I think there's a big difference between William Burroughs the man and William Burroughs the author and William Burroughs the character that we see in his works. These are three separate entities with separate economies controlling the way that they appear to the reader or the onlooker. But I think that William Burroughs the man is the most fraught with ambiguities and confusions and disparities. And in this lecture, I would like to focus on demystifying some of the early traumatic moments of Burroughs' life that really contribute to his work and that I really think that we can feel in his work. Because when you read something like Naked Lunch, especially, you get this idea that it is a pure play of signifiers, textual elements that are completely separate from the world. They're so fantastical that they seem to create their own world, which can survive on its own. But in fact, William Burroughs' work always depends upon the feedback between the world of the text and the world of the reader coming from his or her historical situation, and in addition, the historical situation of Burroughs' time in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s primarily. Now, William Burroughs was born in 1914, so he grows up amidst World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the counterculture, etc., etc., etc. And I think what's so fascinating about him is that if you're anything like me, you think of Burroughs as a sort of liberationist apex. He stands for freedom and the ability to take the reins of one's own life, to will what one wills, doesn't care about any of the barriers between the obscene and the normal. In fact, the normal is treated now as something obscene in a remarkable turn of phrase. And as fun as this would be for this to be the end-all be-all of William Burroughs, this is not the case. I'd like to show in this lecture how Burroughs was struck through by confusions and disparities at the very heart of his character, exemplified by what he calls the ugly spirit, which led him to kill his wife, Joan Vollmer. Now, considering Burroughs' proclivity to flirt with the unacceptable, it's important to mention that Burroughs always had a relationship to the spiritual, the occult, demons, curses, magic, etc. He achieved the rank of clear in the Church of Scientology. He was also very interested in the work of Wilhelm Reich, and he was always enamored with these things that operated on the limits of what was acceptable. He grew up in a very bourgeois kind of environment. His grandfather, William S. Burroughs I, created the adding machine, which was the first calculator, and as a result, his family was very wealthy, both from this business venture and from future philanthropic endeavors of various kinds. And Burroughs was always wrestling with this, I think. He wanted to escape this sense of normalcy because he saw it as a trap and something that infected one's ability to will unique things. William Burroughs says, "I do believe in the magical universe where nothing happens unless one wills it to happen, and what we see is not one God, but many gods in power and in conflict." And that notion of the divine in conflict is very Manichaean and something that Miles goes to various lengths to show. that Burroughs was always skeptical of, for example, the man on the hill sort of attitude of institutional religion, where they have the transcendent God, which is all good, all loving, all powerful, all knowing, etc., etc. And in fact, he wanted to see the divine, just like every ideal, as fraught with holes, wrought with confusions, and things to be unearthed from the past and heraldings of the future. Burroughs, and you can see this in, for example, The Adding Machine, a wonderful collection of essays of Burroughs's, that he was very much concerned with the way that knowledge can herald future events and can be a sort of prophetic gateway. So knowledge is something that is always a bit hermetically sealed for Burroughs, always has this veneer of the mysterious. But despite this, Burroughs was always trying to reckon with an environment that felt unfamiliar to him. He said that when I was a young child, there was always a feeling of attack and damage and danger. And he said it was not just a feeling of being completely at a hopeless disadvantage. It was a ghost of some sort, a spirit that was inimical, completely inimical. And this spirit he called the ugly spirit, and he believed, as Miles says, that it was responsible for the key act that had determined his life since September 6th of 1951. That day he had been walking in the street in Mexico City when he found that his face was wet. Tears were streaming from his eyes for no logical reason. He felt a deep-seated depression, and when he got home, he began throwing down drinks very quickly. It was then, later that day, that Bill killed his wife, Joan Vollmer, fatally wounding her while attempting to shoot a glass from her head in a game of William Tell at a drinks party. Burroughs never really understood what happened that day, except to recognize that what he did was madness. And near the end of his life, he said, "My accidental shootings of my wife in 1951 has been a heavy, painful burden to me for 41 years. It was a horrible thing, and it still hurts to realize that some people think it was somehow deliberate. I've been honest about the circumstances. We were both very drunk and reckless. She dared me to shoot a glass off of her head, and for God knows what reason I took the dare. All of my life I have regretted that day." He even said that the ugly spirit killed Joan, and for the rest of his life he would be convinced that he was possessed by some sort of otherworldly virus. One of my favorite quotes of Burroughs that really highlights the intersection between the paranormal/esoteric and the world of mental health. He says that every man has inside himself a parasitic being who is acting not at all to his advantage. And I've mentioned this quote in other lectures. There's two ways that it can be taken. Either that everyone has inside himself a parasitic being who is not acting entirely to his advantage, or not acting whatsoever to his advantage. So it's either this ambiguous kind of on your side, kind of not, or a perfectly Manichaean opposite that works towards one's disillusion. And this sense of disillusion and personal attack is something really, really central to Burroughs' life. It's one of the key themes that you can see is the sense of the self to fragment. In the Cut Up trilogy, for example, there are literally experiments in which the self is turned into two dueling halves of sorts, pulled apart at the seams and threaded back together in a really unearthly kind of way. And you can see this theme in the talking asshole scene from Naked Lunch, perhaps his most famous piece of writing that he ever wrote. And in Naked Lunch, this asshole learns to talk, and then it starts to slowly envelop the character to the point where he eventually is just a brain trapped in a body, and then you see the lights go out. And this threat of envelopment and enclosure is something that really frightened Burroughs. It was something that he tried to exorcise by all means. There's a fantastic scene in The Ticket That Exploded in which he literally tries to exorcise this ugly spirit for maybe 15 pages. It's very brilliant and very lucid and expressive and raw. I would definitely recommend you check it out. But he had a very ambiguous relationship to this evil spirit, such that there was both a profound discontinuity within himself and also a sense of cohesion through momentum, through the aesthetic momentum to push oneself into the future past one's mistakes. And I think this is something we can all learn from Burroughs, because a lot of people are put off by Burroughs' crime of shooting his wife and the fact that he got away with it. But I think that, on the contrary, it represents a profound low point, the likes of which any person could be succumbed to. It's the kind of thing that we can all empathize with, in a sense, because it's the very kind of thing we couldn't imagine happening. And I would assume it's not something that Burroughs imagined could happen until it happened to himself. He says that I am forced to the appalling conclusion that I would never have become a writer but for Joan's death, and to a realization of the extent to which this event has motivated and formulated my writing. I live with the constant threat of possession and a constant need to escape from possession, from control. So the death of Joan brought me in contact with the invader, the ugly spirit, and maneuvered me into a lifelong struggle in which I have no choice except to write my way out. And this begins the central theme of writing to Burroughs' life, which is not just one of escape. As we develop, we're going to see that far from just being a form of catharsis, writing was deeply painful for Burroughs. It was a way of facing up to the various traumas and tragedies that we're going to be discussing furthermore in this lecture. And although he saw his indebtedness to his past, and I think that's something really hard to admit after making such a profound mistake as this, but this constant threat of possession and of control, we can see, is not always something coming from the outside. It's well known that Burroughs was opposed to institutional control, but he was also wary of control by the body and by the things internal to the mind. He was wary of, for example, language as a virus, and language has no extra-human existence. It depends upon the existence of utterers and of thinkers in order for language to have a coherent and reified existence. So things such as this, which are profoundly human phenomena, and in fact are not really material in a certain sense, are extremely central to Burroughs' way of thinking and writing. And I think what's so profoundly confusing about Burroughs is that he had such an idyllic home life in many respects. Born in St. Louis, Missouri, he was in a very well-off family. His family was multi-millionaires, taking into account inflation and whatnot, and his family loved him and never fought. In fact, William's mother told him that I worship the ground you walk on. And this relationship between his mother, Laura, and William is always something that has perplexed me, because if you look into William Burroughs' writing, you see not only a sense of misogyny, but of a pure and unbridled hate for females. You'll notice that there's a curious lack of female characters in Burroughs' writing. They're present on occasion, but all of, for example, the heights of William Burroughs' aesthetic mind are these sort of all-male utopias, or dystopias in certain senses. I'm thinking of The Wild Boys, where you have a sort of fraternal society that gets on its own, is able to use its hands and exercise its will over nature and also with nature. I also think of Ghost of Chance, where he talks about the relationship of humans to nature, and there is a fraternal group there as well. William stated that my parents apparently got along just perfectly. There was never a quarrel. I never saw any signs of friction. Never. Not only was there no fights, but There was never a raised voice, nothing like that. It's amazing when you come to think of it. They saw each other all the time. All the time. And one of the things that's very interesting is that in spite of this very normal environment, William's mental health, as well as his mother's mental health from a very young age, were anything but normal. Miles writes that Billy was a sensitive child and prone to visions. Much of the connection with his mother came from Burroughs' belief in magic and the world of the occult. He had intermittent fevers and saw animals in the wall of his bedroom. I've always been a believer in spirits, the supernatural, like my mother. It was a weird family. And I think it's very surprising that despite their very normal material circumstances, they were a very weird family in many regards. William said that I am motionless in this sequence, a silent witness. And this notion of being subject to psychic, spiritual, demonic, otherworldly forces is something that we can see influenced by his relationship to Laura, his mother. Laura was extremely interested in psychic phenomena, and Burroughs often spoke of her as having clairvoyant powers. Billy had a dream accompanied by a smell of coal gas that he was standing in front of his mother, leaning over her like a dinosaur and eating her back. Quote, "Now mother comes screaming into the room. I had a terrible dream that you were eating my back. I have a long neck that reaches up and over her head. My face in the dream is wooden with horror." End quote. This dream recurred throughout his life and was described in a number of his books. He and Laura seemed to be psychically connected, and his childhood memories were almost all of his mother. Quote, "I remember a long time ago when I lay in bed beside my mother, watching lights from the streets move across the ceiling and down the walls. I feel the sharp nostalgia of train whistles, piano music down a city street, burning leaves." And of course, this is a very idyllic picture, but also influenced by this strange sort of psychic confusion that they were dealing with. And in fact, his relationships to females were added to not just by his relationship with his mother, but also by his Welsh nanny, Mary Evans. Now, William Burroughs was obsessed with Mary Evans. He would go in temper tantrums whenever she left, asking, "All I want is Nursey," and just throwing a fit. And Burroughs later assumed, this is from Miles, that his need for her must indicate that she filleted him to calm him and send him to sleep. But he also told one of his analysts that Nursey was severe, and said that when she caught him masturbating, she threatened to cut off his penis. Hardly compatible with fellation. And we can see that this is a very early and very traumatic situation that William found himself in. And this really, to me, marks one of the beginning points of his ambivalence towards his own sexuality and towards his body. William Burroughs' writing is tremendously bodily. That's one of the chief themes and one of the chief sorts of continuities that you can see across his writing. Regardless of the various trilogies that he starts, the body is always directly implicated and talked about with no fetters whatsoever. There is no sense of obscenity in Burroughs' writing because there's no binarization between the normal and the obscene. The obscene is the everyday, and when it's the everyday, it loses that capacity of obscenity. And in fact, although Burroughs said that he knew he was homosexual by the time he was 13, his earliest crushes and experiments were fraught with anxiety and difficulty. He said that at that time, I was felt by the other boys to be not quite right. Your character, just the wrong kind. And he was very sensitive and insecure 12-year-old, hovering on the brink of adolescence, saying, quote, I think it was always there, at the same time being afraid of the others and apart from them. I always felt a necessity to play it cool and conceal myself. I don't know how or at what age that it occurred to me that I was of another species. It would have occurred to me, of course, no matter where I lived, sooner or later. I felt inferior to other people. At the same time I'd feel different from them, I'd feel better than them. It was a really confusing feeling. I was terribly afraid of any physical conflict. And the relationship of Burroughs to physical conflict is one that has always confounded me, because as he would develop and mature, he would grow obsessed with physical violence, both in attempting it himself, but never actually going through with it, except for a few domestic situations. And he would also be obsessed with guns and the sort of gunslinging Western aesthetic. And I think this is something that we can see is both a coping mechanism and a means to kind of stop up certain problems from flowing loose. There's a very early relationship to bodily harm that I think is really influential in Bill Burroughs' life, in which all of his friends had chemistry sets, wooden boxes with little compartments filled with chemicals. He would pour ammonia over iodide crystals to make ammonium iodide. This compound, when it dries, is so sensitive that a fly will explode it. Quote, I remember how I used to while away the long 1920s afternoons with sugar sprinkled around little heaps of ammonium iodide, waiting for the flies to explode in little puffs of purple vapor. We can see the sort of obsession with physical violence, which, granted, this is not too out of the ordinary for an adolescent boy, but we'll see it take a whole nother turn as Bill and his friends all made black powder, which they would put in boxes and throw, causing a loud explosion. When Bill was 14, he was at work in the basement of Price Road and had carefully packed a mixture of potassium chlorate and red phosphorus into a box. He was putting the top on when the friction caused the chemicals to explode, shredding his left hand. His father, who was working with tools in the next room, rushed in, quickly wrapped his hand in a cloth, and drove him straight to the nearest hospital emergency room in University City. He was operated by Dr. Masters, who spent 2 hours carefully removing the wooden splinters from his damaged hand. The injury was so serious that Bill remained in hospital for 6 weeks with his hands bandaged. In the days before penicillin, there was a terrible danger of infection, which could have resulted in gangrene or amputation. Changing the dressings was terribly painful, and Bill's father came to see him every day. It was a bad injury, and Bill was exempt from gym and athletics for a year. Dr. Masters telling Bill's parents that he had given him nearly an adult dose of morphine, something that stuck in Bill's mind. The explosion and hospitalization transformed Bill from being a very talkative boy to a very reserved one, a profound character change. This change suggests that 6 weeks of enforced idleness and boredom brought about a sudden self-awareness. Most people have an adolescent epiphany, a conscious moment when they realize they are the person looking through their eyes at the world, that they are on a small planet revolving in the middle of infinity. Being alone in the hospital appears to have undermined Bill's unconditional acceptance of the all-encompassing bourgeois value system he grew up with. Suddenly finding himself outside it showed it was fallible and not permanent, fixed. He was alone with his thoughts, his experience of the green reindeer and his visions. He became afraid of the dark and kept a pair of brass knuckle-busters beneath his pillow at night. He always had sinus trouble, and when he had a fever, often saw animals in the wall. Laura, of course, thought nothing of this, because she also had fever visions. In Burroughs' own cosmology, the damage to his hand would have provided an entry point for the ugly spirit. Self-awareness came with recognition of the ugly spirit, and it was incidentally the same hand that he later mutilated by cutting off part of his finger in a psychotic episode. And we'll get to detailing that psychotic episode in more detail. But notice here the notion of physical trauma as an entry point for otherworldly forces. There's a sense of the fear of having the body penetrated by the outside, creating a very interior mindset. And this is something that we can see Burroughs really struggling with, a sense of sort of inferiority and subservience. For example, when William had a crush on one of the boys at the Los Alamos school in which he went, which was this kind of outdoorsy school where you learned how to work with your hands and hike and run and learn trade skills and whatnot. And this boy, William Russell Fawcett, had pimples, and Burroughs said that I find pimples quite attractive. We did actually jack each other off under the sheets with flashlights on. Then he said that he thought this was all wrong. He said, "I think you're going to be the sort of person that will be revolted by a naked woman." He finally got to hating me completely. You see, boys with Kells and Russell's faucet, when I was attracted to them, I became extremely subservient and actually made myself an object of contempt to the boy, for being so much more interested in him than he was in me. Abject. It was horrid, horrible. I don't blame them. In the end, it was Fawcett who was the cause of Burroughs leaving the school. Bill had known that he was homosexual since he was 13, but he didn't know how to do anything about it, as he seemed attracted to heterosexual boys, which is doubtless an uncomfortable and confusing state to be in, trying to work out your sexuality, especially in a time where it is seen as a disease to be a homosexual. And indeed, we can see this sense of subservience plays out in very interesting ways, because we see Burroughs as such a domineering perspective in his work. The words that he writes carry their weight on their own. They don't need any help. They will have their effects on their own. They don't need to be played in any special context. In fact, you can take Burroughs out of context and very often still get quite the same effect because of the very brute way in which he goes about writing. But in fact, his understanding of his sexuality was fraught with challenges, because Laura was very understanding about it, but to her, homosexuality was a terrible, frightening illness. She said, "We'll send you to a doctor who will fix this up. We'll spend every penny if necessary." They got back to St. Louis, and she sent Bill to a psychiatrist friend of theirs, Dr. Sidney Schwab, for a psychiatric evaluation. Quote, "We talked a little bit about the Greeks and decided that it wasn't to be taken too seriously, and he assured my mother that it was a phase and that I would grow out of it. He was a nice enough old man." And Burroughs would not grow out of it. In fact, what it is never entirely known, because Burroughs didn't really fit into the gay scene. You can see that in some of his writings when he talks about, for example, gay bars, he talks about them with a sense of disgust, perhaps because Burroughs was so discomforted about the idea of social norms that had to be upkept in social scenarios. He didn't like to play by the books, and I think that he saw gay culture as a sort of break-off which was liberatory in some senses, but also restrictive in other senses. There was a sense of gatekeeping that just in heterosexual communities he probably saw as off-putting. And in fact, when he left the Los Alamos school, due to the fact that this experiment with his homosexuality made him so confused and distraught, he actually left behind an incriminating diary in which he detailed a lot of his fantasies. And he said that "I used to turn cold thinking that maybe the boys are reading it aloud to each other. When the box finally arrived, I pried it open and threw everything out until I found the diary and destroyed it forthwith without a glance at the appalling pages. The act of writing had become embarrassing, disgusting, and above all, false. It was not the sex in the diary that embarrassed me. It was the terrible falsity of the emotions expressed. The sight of my words on a page sickened me, and this continued until 1938. I had written myself an 8-year sentence." And there's a lot of very specific verbiage here. For one, he speaks of a sentence when referring to his own mental condition. So in a sense, he saw his body and furthermore his mind as a prison. And the idea of being false, of the falsity of the emotions expressed, well, we can only just kind of speculate what that means, right? Does he mean that he's not actually gay? Does he mean that he coded it too much? Does he mean that he exaggerated it? It's really hard to say, because sometimes Burroughs has these really problematic ways of talking about gay people that makes it seem that, in a sense, he internalized this sense of bigotry of his generation and brought that with him, despite his prolific liberationist mentality that carries around with him in his work. And in fact, his relationship to institutions and to war and violence, we can see very early on in the fact that after just a short amount of time at Los Alamos, he and everyone else at the Los Alamos school was kicked out by none other than the U.S. military. Helicopters and troopers just came in all of a sudden and said, well, you got to leave. And who hopped out of one of these choppers but Robert Oppenheimer? It was at the Los Alamos school that the atomic bomb was invented. And Burroughs always saw a strange sort of irony in that he was, in a sense, complicit with this war scheme by association, that he was part of the culture in which their school would be the kind of place that people would want to build a bomb at. And as Burroughs is developing, he's still trying to work through his sexuality. Bill was 21, but he had never had a lover. His sexual experience was restricted to mutual masturbation and blowjobs. He wanted a boyfriend, but he had no idea how to find one. The final realization that he preferred boys had resulted in a complete paralysis of action and no sex at all. None of his visits to New York had resulted in full sexual relations, although his friend Bill Gilmore claimed that Bill was very promiscuous in his first years at Harvard, but much less so in the last 2 years. Bill was socially inept. He didn't know how to act, didn't know the right things to say in order to pick someone up, even in a gay bar in New York. And in fact, when he would go to these bars and clubs and whatnot, he would often get female prostitutes saying that it was all right. You got a sense of release and pleasure, and you felt you've done something very socially acceptable. I used to drive from there over to Culpepper's bar on the corner of Euclid and Maryland, go there and talk to your buddies, get a little drunk, made you feel like a man. And that notion of feeling like a man is one of the more problematic aspects of Burroughs, because indeed he is at a cultural moment where there's a very profound discontinuity between the state and the masses that is becoming very, very apparent with, for example, the Vietnam War, where we realize that our states were not acting for the self-interest of the common man, but for the self-interest of corporations or states or people with business power and whatnot. And this notion of feeling like a man, I think we can see that in his obsession with guns. He was always holding a gun. In fact, one of his boyfriends mentioned one time that he was in bed with William Burroughs and he felt at his foot a gun. And he goes, William, is that a gun? And he was like, yes, that's a gun, with his very nasally voice from his sinus problems. But this notion of feeling like a man is something that perhaps can be traced back to these needing to fit in, but also feeling different, and that creating a sense of confusion in his head. But the extent of Bill's sexual ignorance emerged when he was in his senior year at Harvard University. He said, until the age of 22, I thought that children were born through the navel. I did. It was an evening with James LeBaron Boyle, Richard Stern, and Graham Ayres Monsell that I was expressing this theory, which I thought was a fact, and they said, what? Then they enlightened me to the horrible fact, the facts of life. I knew about female genitals. I knew they had a hole down there, but I did not know that the baby was born down there. I never had one of those man-to-man talks with my father. He would have been shit scared. He was the most prissy heterosexual I've ever known. And that relationship to his father, we can only speculate, and there's some early kind of notions of his relationship to his father, but he's so privileged in many regards that it's really difficult to talk about any sense of trauma in the familial sense as just being like a natural aspect of their environment, because he had such a nice environment. He even said, as I mentioned earlier, that there was no conflict between his parents. He wasn't working through, a divorcing family or whatnot. But as he finished Harvard, he decided that he was kind of unsure what he wanted to do, and he decided, okay, I'll go study medicine. So he went to Vienna and decided to study medicine. And there he met Isa, who would become his first wife. And at the time that the Nazis started truly coming into power, Bill Burroughs was kind of watching this with a sense of curiosity in a sense, because, you're wondering what is the future going to look like, but also a sense of terror of, what is this going to mean for my friends? And Ilse was one of such people that would be influenced because she was a German Jew. Now, she was living in Vienna at this point when her and Burroughs met, and she was frantic with worry. Her Yugoslavian visa was about to expire, but as a Jew, she couldn't renew it. She would have to return to Germany. There, the Nuremberg laws had already excluded German Jews from Reich citizenship, prohibited them from holding public office and from marrying or having sexual relations with persons of, quote, German or German-related blood. She could see what was coming, and she asked Bill to marry her. For her, it was a matter of life or death, whereas for Bill, marriage meant nothing. He knew he was gay and unlikely ever to want to marry. He told Ted Morgan, obviously she was pushing this. I guess I was pretty malleable. I said, well, it wouldn't hurt anything. Remember, there was a lot of pressure coming from a very experienced woman who knows how to exert pressure on someone who, at the same time, had no very clear orientation. And she was also being pushed by a desperate need. Bill was 23 and she 38, but they were genuinely good friends, so, as he said, I was doing it to be a nice guy. And so Bill Burroughs' first marriage began. And I think something really important here is the sense of empathy that Burroughs had. This is something that I see as often entirely unnoticed when reading William Burroughs, is that there is always a sense of empathy and direct connection with Burroughs. You may be muddled and confused about the content, but there is always a sense of direct psychic connection through the medium of the text to Burroughs. Now we have to kind of figure out exactly how does the text filter between Burroughs, the authorial persona, and Burroughs, the man, and Burroughs, the character in his works that we get the most direct access to. But nevertheless, you get instant affective experience when you read Burroughs' writing. And in fact, I think this can be related to a number of his sexual escapades. For example, he meets an 18-year-old Jack Anderson who lived in an old red brick rooming house at 55 Jane Street in the West Village, near the meatpacking district. Bill described him as having a beautiful face, a very mediocre body, and a sort of chorus girl, shop girl mentality. Cheap, essentially cheap. Despite these comments, Bill Burroughs loved him, and one night, Bill and Jack were having sex in Bill's room when a hotel security man, patrolling the corridors to make sure all the rooms were locked, looked in and caught them in flagrant. Bill had forgotten to lock the door, and 10 minutes later, the house director and the hotel manager burst in and found them both stark naked. Outraged at the intrusion, Bill demanded, "What's going on here?" "Well, we want to know what's going on here," they replied. Bill's imperious manner didn't daunt them, and the house detective said, "You're the wisest prick I ever walked in on." Bill regarded this as quite a compliment. The detective asked, "Didn't anyone ever kick the shit out of you?" Bill was given 10 minutes to pack his things. He was told to go to the cashier's window where he was given a refund, and they were thrown out in the middle of the night. And this is a sense of rejection that you can see Burroughs is always kind of towing the line and kind of straddling the middle point between acceptability as a commodifiable figure, viz. Bill Burroughs, the author, and also something that must be entirely rejected, that's so disgusting that the culture couldn't subsume it without struggling some sort of profound discontinuity and sense of cultural trauma. So he was always a sort of viral contagion that had to be kept at a distance. And Burroughs' relationship to violence really escalated at this time. One of the few violent episodes of his life occurred when Jack and his girlfriend were visiting Burroughs in his room at Jane Street. Quote, "His girlfriend, who was wildly jealous, suddenly hit me and knocked my glasses off, and I just hauled off and hit her with one. She kept complaining, 'I happen to love Jack. I happen to love Jack.' Drunk out of her mind. This went on for hours. Then, all of a sudden, the bitch hauled off and hit me. Instead of acting like a professor, I just hauled off and whammed her one and knocked her across the room onto the couch. Jack did nothing. I hit her real hard, slamming her in the face. I was amazed to see this happen from my fist. I'm stronger than I know I am. She got up, sort of subdued. She assumed this was her due. It really stopped the whole scene. End quote. Bill was becoming irrational. He warned Jack that if he didn't give up the woman, he would cut off a finger. At the same time, he recognized that his obsession with Anderson was neurotic and that he needed help. And this is a very problematic character, right? He's not the sort of person that you just want to worship whole cloth. He's got some serious problems in the way that he comports himself towards women. And, I'm sure we've all had moments that we're not proud of, but, seeing it on the page really sheds light on Burroughs. And in fact, this irrationality and the sense of neuroticism would take a whole nother spin when his parents noticed that their son was growing more dissociated from reality and unable to function normally. Anderson was this first real lover and had triggered in Burroughs a torrent of suppressed feelings that he was unable to control. He was powerless in his efforts to make Anderson return his love, and his emotions were overwhelming him. A seething mixture of rage, frustration, feelings of betrayal, erotic fantasies, and revenge. On April 23, 1940, Burroughs walked up 6th Avenue from 42nd Street looking for a cutlery store amongst the pawn shops. He wanted to buy poultry shears like the ones his father used to cut through the joints when he carved the turkey at his grandmother's Thanksgiving dinners. He found them. Stainless steel, one blade curved, the other sharp, serrated to hold the meat in place. They were $2.79 plus tax. Paying $1 in advance, he booked into the Ariston Hotel, an apartment hotel on 6th Avenue famous for its gay bath scene. He unwrapped the brown paper package and placed the end joint of his left little finger between the blades. In his short story, The Finger, he wrote, quote, "He took a deep breath, pressed the handle quick and hard. He felt no pain. The finger joint fell on the dresser. Lee turned his hand over and looked at the stub. Blood spurted up and hit him in the face. He felt a sudden deep pity for the finger joint that lay there on the dresser, a few drops of blood gathering around the white bone. Tears came to his eyes. It didn't do anything, he said, in a broken child's voice." End quote. He crudely bandaged his finger, put the finger joint in his waistcoat pocket, and left. He felt a wave of euphoria and stopped at a bar and ordered a double brandy. Goodwill flowed out of him for everyone he saw, for the whole world. A lifetime of defensive hostility had fallen from him. And that's a direct Burroughs quote there. And this notion of euphoria, of catharsis through bodily pain, is, of course, related to this masochistic sort of imagery that we see all throughout Burroughs. In fact, they always acted out various scenes from his books, and there's a famous picture of him and a friend acting out a hanging scene from Naked Lunch. And, this is very problematic and strange, but it really highlights where he's trying to negotiate this relationship to the body, to his own body, to the body as a category of prison or vessel or consummated tool. And things got really weird when Burroughs was, in fact, basically coaxed into a mental institution. This doctor persuaded Bill to come with him to the office in Bellevue to have the finger dressed to avoid infection. But once he got there, Bill was tricked into signing some papers and found himself in a psych ward. He was interviewed and committed. The finger stub had to have its own burial and death certificate in case someone found it and the police spent time looking for the rest of the body. And throughout this time in the Institute, we really see some of his psychic troubles really coming to the fore. Bill remained aloof from the other patients, Smiles writes. He spent most of his time in his room playing solitaire or reading. The nurses went through his belongings and found several joints of marijuana, which they confiscated. They also found a series of strange Bruegel-like symbolic drawings of torture and sex organs, the expression of what was going on in his head. His admission interview was unsatisfactory because Bill did not want his parents to know that the event that triggered this was a homosexual relationship, and told the doctors a story about being jilted by a girl. Bill's mother arrived, and Bill told her that he was interested in perceptions of pain, and that he had cut off his little finger to be able to prove to himself that if one concentrated on not feeling pain, one could cut off a finger and feel nothing. He told her he felt no pain in doing it. Laura, as usual, believed every word. On April 30th, On being assured of patient confidentiality, he finally told the doctors about the homosexual affair. Throughout his interviews, the doctors reported that he spoke in an affected manner of exaggerated politeness, as though condescending to explain something to someone of a lower intellect. He told them that his yoga breathing had sometimes given him hallucinations and given him feelings of unreality that lasted up to 24 hours, a state that he enjoyed. Dr. Wiggers, this doctor that actually coaxed him into the institution, told the doctors that he saw Bill 3 times a week and that Bill sometimes went into periods of catatonic rage, sat with his arms fixed rigidly, staring into space, or with his eyes crossed. Bill was discharged from Payne Whitney on May 23rd with the statistical diagnosis of dementia praecox, schizophrenia, catatonic type. A note on his discharge paper says, quote, "The patient is likely to have further difficulty. Will probably have to be hospitalized again at some later date." And indeed, he would go through various stages of increasingly getting more and more psychically erratic. For example, he visited the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago to make contact with some Egyptologists, because he was now considering in going back for some graduate work of some kind, perhaps in Egyptology, after he had done some work in Mayan languages. As he entered, he suddenly heard a voice inside him, shrieking in his ears, "You don't belong here. You can't do this." He said, "Of course. Subsequently, I've had many experiences of such voices. That was an early experience. Someone wanted to block me from having any contact with Egyptian hieroglyphs." And we can see that there's a sort of double hermetic sealing going on here, where the hermetically sealed is being hermetically sealed by Burroughs' own ambivalence towards his mental health. And this would reach strange conclusions as he got more and more interested in violence. In fact, Burroughs planned to rob a Brinks armored truck. The idea was to place a large quantity of dynamite in a manhole and blow up the truck as it passed over it. Bill and his collaborator would then rush out and grab the money. He got as far as visiting City Hall to inspect the sewer maps and reconnoitering the route of the truck. He drew a map of the robbery site, but it went no further than that. Carr doubted that Bill got as far as buying dynamite for the job. Another plan was to rob Jack's Turkish Baths at 829 North Dearborn Street, which in the late 40s was the best-known gay bathhouse in Chicago. Burroughs was a regular at Jack's, which was the venue for one of his more memorable homosexual encounters. He told James Grauerholtz, quote, "The redhead was in Jack's Baths. That was a whole set that I've used so frequently. See, it was mirrors, red carpet, red-haired," end quote. Now, Bill snooped around and found that the safe was emptied each day at 6 p.m. when the maximum amount of money was on the premises. But in order to work up the courage to pull off the heist, Bill spent the afternoon drinking. When he finally pulled his gun on the cashier, the man laughed and said, "Bill, you know the money leaves here at 6 o'clock. It's 6:15. Burroughs was able to make fun of himself later in telling the story, but he must have been humiliated at the time, and he was lucky that the cashier knew him. The cashier could well have shot him or called the police. Clearly, Burroughs would not have lasted long as a criminal. And this should just serve to give you some initial sketches of Burroughs' relationship to his sexuality, to his family, to violence, to bourgeois/revisionist culture. And I think that he's such an interesting person to understand on a biographical note, because hopefully through Miles's work, it should be more clear exactly how William Burroughs, the man, intersects with the authorial persona and the character in his works, such as, for example, William Lee. That being said, that's it for this lecture. Consider checking out any of my other ones on postmodernism, gender theory, postcolonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. Maybe you need help talking about a philosophy problem or some readings or whatever it may be. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to do a one-time donation to the channel, because I appreciate everyone who helps donate to the channel. It helps make this possible, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.